I have been his bodyguard for over a decade now. There's never been an issue. Sure, some of the fans were strange, and there's been a hairy convention or two, but there's never been any problems. If adoring public ever got too close to my boss, I would just push them off, raise my shoulders and tell them clearly and sternly that he needs some space. A crazy with a knife, maybe some kid with a Chapman complex. That's what I was looking out for. That's what I considered to be worst case scenario. That's what I thought would be a credible threat. Little did I know that there's men like Henry Willow out there. You do not know my boss's name, but you do know his work. Back in the 90s, he was involved in the creation of an intellectual property that took the world by storm. TV, movies, games, cards, merchandise. You are definitely familiar. Most of his public appearances are at conventions, but every once in a while, when a superfan writes in, he will do a private meet and greet. Every time I went traveling with my boss, it was to meet a sick fan or maybe someone with a business proposal. Normal stuff. Nothing exciting to write about. But then one day a letter came in from certain Henry Willow. Henry, or Professor Willow, as he referred to himself in the letter, claimed to be a steadfast supporter of my boss's work, a rapturous audience to everything connected to the intellectual property, licensed or not. He even dreamt nightly of the creatures my boss had created. Being a man of significant means, Henry Willow wanted to show his thanks with a private theatrical performance. A jet would be chartered at our nearest convenience. My boss seemed excited about the prospect of being flown out for something fancy. When he asked me about my opinion, I said the invitation seemed fine to me. The place for theatrical performance was a provincial town just outside the Chinese border. Maybe that should have given me some pause, but it didn't. I was just happy to go visit a part of the world I hadn't seen yet. Within 3 days of my boss's reply, we had a jet waiting for us. Contractors paid in full for the next 2 weeks. My boss could visit whenever he wanted, and if he found bodyguard necessary, so be it. I tried finding out as much as I could about this Henry Willow during the flight, but the crew knew nothing about him. All they could say is that he was very generous. The town we arrived in couldn't have had a population more than 50,000, but it had the smoothest runway I ever landed on. When we got out, the asphalt felt brand new. The rest of the city looked battered. Old Soviet panel houses and remnants of factories stretched out as far as I could see. Out from beyond all the cement peeked out the tower of discount Art Deco hotel. We were picked up from the airport by cheery hotel staff. They too mainly talked about how very generous Professor Willow was. One of them mentioned that he's a scientist, but any details remained a mystery. I was given a room in the basement while my boss got a presidential suite. Before I even managed to put my bags down, he was calling me up. Willow had provided gifts apparently. The accommodations of the basement room were Spartan: bed, dresser, and off-smelling but private ensuite bathroom. The presidential suite was fancy enough, with its parrel and terrace and atrium, yet it was the Willow's gifts that made the luxury excessive. Not only had he ordered just about every bottle of liquor imaginable to the room, he also laid out a plethora of jewels and watches on the bed. Some of the accessories were related to the creatures my boss designed and were terribly kitsch for it, but there was a gold-plated digital watch that caught my eye. I asked my boss if I could take it. He said I could take two. Just as the overwhelming generosity of our host was starting to dawn on us, there was a knock on the door. It was one of the hotel employees, grinning from ear to ear, trying to keep us as happy as possible. Whenever we were ready, she said, Professor Willow was waiting for us in the restaurant. Henry Willow was a lanky bald man with an intense stare. The moment we appeared in the doorway, he lunged from his seat to greet my boss. Willow embraced my boss with such vigor that I wondered whether I shouldn't step in. My boss didn't seem to mind though. Our mysterious benefactor was definitely strange, but his love for my boss's creations seemed genuine. Everything had been cleared away in the restaurant. Only a single rotating table remained at the center of the hall. I would have felt awkward standing behind my boss for the duration of the dinner, but Willow already had 2 men flanking his seat. Twin giants with shaved heads. The suits they wore barely fit them, and their dull eyes stared off into the ether. At first, Willow excitedly spoke about my boss's work, the same way any other fan would. He told him about his favorite creatures, about the moments in the lore that resonated with him, about the future of my boss's intellectual property. It was as Willow spoke about the future, however, that his speech started to slowly morph. Our strange benefactor didn't speak about the creatures my boss committed to paper as the things of the imagination. Willow spoke about them as real creatures. He spoke about them in a future tense. The conversation I was listening in on was strange, but so was the entire night. Willow seemed harmless enough. About halfway through the meal, however, my boss asked if he could share some of the food with me. All of the stuff set up on the table was inspired by my boss's creations, and there was a particular beef roll that he insisted I had to try. Neither Willow nor his guards acknowledged me for the whole evening. When my boss asked if he could share some of the food, our generous host agreed, but there was a disgust in the look he spared me. The beef roll my boss passed me was indeed delicious, yet much of its taste was lost in the discomfort I felt. Willow's glare was momentary, but the gaze of his muscle was singular. As I chewed, the massive guards chewed along with me, as if trying to mirror my movements. As their jaws shifted and their mouths opened, I quickly started to suspect they had no teeth. Once the main course was finished, the table was cleared by the ever-so-friendly hotel staff. Then, dessert and coffee were brought out. As all the gourmet puddings and cakes were carried to the table, a group of dozen or so musicians entered the restaurant and prepared for the performance. They played an awe-inspiring rendition of the theme song for the show based off my boss's work. The music was truly marvelous. It even brought a tear to my boss's eye. Once the song was finished and the plates were cleared, I presumed the night to be over. I was more than happy to go to my barren room and sleep off all the strangeness of the evening. Henry Willow, however, had different plans. The dinner was just an appetizer for the night's plans. There was something else, something much more impressive he wanted my boss to see. It would be a bit of a drive, but Henry Willow promised an unforgettable experience. On our way out of the hotel, I asked my boss how he was feeling. It was quite late in the evening already, and there wasn't much about Henry Willow that suggested normalcy, but he was happy to continue watching the night unfold. Willow's strange glare, his odd toothless guards, the entire lavish nature of the visit. It all made me uncomfortable. With my boss unbothered, however, I stayed quiet. One of his guards took the wheel and I sat in the front seat while Professor and my boss sat in the back. My worries about Henry Willow's sanity and intentions did not improve in the car. The moment we started moving, Willow began to talk about his dreams. Apparently, back in university, in the 80s, well before my boss's work was public, he saw the creatures in a feverish vision which dictated the rest of his life. Willow kept asking my boss how he came up with his ideas, whether he too had been visited in his sleeps with what Willow called visions of the future. The bald man's speech became more erratic with every word that came out of his mouth, but my boss kept his cool. When Willow demanded to know the source of his inspiration, my boss simply smiled and told him it was a trade secret. Henry Willow was frustrated by the lack of shared dreams, but he took his frustration in stride. The moment my boss rebuffed him, the man started to speak of science. Willow had made his fortune in the field of biology. That is all I could gather from his talk. Very quickly, the scientist's speech descended into academic babble, which I couldn't comprehend. I don't know if my boss understood anything that Willow was saying, but if he didn't let it show. As Henry Willow rambled about the intricacies of genetic modification, my boss simply smiled and nodded. The moon was high up in the sky, and the flat land around us was painted in light. We drove through the featureless steppe for about 45 minutes when our destination started to rise on the horizon. Like a man-made boil in the midst of the smooth nature, the thing rose from the ground. A domed city. Willow Town. The professor was still working out the name, but he was certain of one thing: the city was the future. It is from this domed place that he would rule when the end came. It is here that people would be safe from the final century. The gate which led into the dome was staffed by 4 men with rifles that looked identical to the bodyguards Willow had brought to our dinner. With far-off looks, they waved the car past the translucent glass and into the city. The rows of panel houses that lined the edges of the town didn't look any different from the ones we had seen around our hotel, yet the city differed in one unavoidable aspect. At its center stood a mammoth grassy hill, and at the top of the hill sat a structure of jagged metal, which looked like some sort of factory. Willow proudly pointed to the terrible building and claimed that it was his laboratory. The whole complex had been built inside of the hill. Anyone who was inside of it would be safe when the end came. Before we had a chance to inquire what end Willow was talking about, the car stopped. At the foot of the hill stood a dozen or so teenagers with a couple of Willow's bald-headed giants. The kids had ragged clothes and looked hungry, yet the moment we got out of the car, they broke into song. My boss enjoyed the rendition of the theme song we heard at the hotel. This performance he appreciated a lot less. The teens looked haggard and unwell, and even though they sang with gusto, none of them appeared to be comfortable. When their performance finished, my boss started to inquire about their well-being. Willow shrugged off all his questions. The youths understood their purpose, he said. They would be proud to become role models for the world that was to come. Before my boss managed to make any more inquiries, the earth at the base of the hill parted to reveal a gate. Beyond the gate was a hallway of pure white metal. Willow's guards left a little room for negotiation. We were to follow the professor. The hallway crisscrossed with identical passages and was filled with cameras which followed our every move. The crowd of teens moved with us at the start of the journey, but without a single sound they veered off a couple minutes in. I was trying to keep track of what turns we were taking throughout the walk, but it was difficult to focus. Henry Willow's already erratic speech had soundly descended into madness. He wouldn't stop raving about the final century and how culture will have to be reinvented, and plethora of other insane claims. Willow's madness was on full display, and it was beyond unnerving, but what made the situation so much worse were the moments where he would pause, smile at my boss, and claimed that he was just telling him things he already knew. All of these things were already discussed in the vision which both of them had. My boss did not comment on Willow's assertions. He simply smiled and nodded, and would shoot me a worried glance whenever Professor was distracted with his ramblings. Our unease steadily grew throughout the night, but it wasn't until we reached our destination that it reached its peak. Deep inside the complex sat a massive hall the size of a football pitch. The ground was of packed earth and delineated into two halves with chalk. Standing on each side of the arena stood two of the teens we had seen outside. Each of them had a strange metal contraption attached to their wrist, which seemed to weigh them down to one side. From our viewing gallery, Willow rambled once more. He spoke of how after the final century passes, culture must be born anew. He spoke of how these teens, these hybrid masters as he called them, would inspire the common folk and remind them of the new social hierarchy. Willow raved about some fantastical new world order he had envisioned, and then, with the passion of an orchestra conductor, he ordered the battle to begin. I half expected the children to start fighting each other, but they did not. What happened was much stranger than that. Each of the teens extended the arm with the metal bracelet on it. With a static snap, two creatures which defied expectation appeared on each side of the arena. One of the beasts was a snake. It floated in the air, suspended by what seemed to be dozens of little wings spread out down its spine. The second creature almost looked like an oversized raccoon, with the exception of its bright, massive tail, which blistered with sparks. Under shouted orders from the teens, the creatures threw themselves at each other and began to fight. My boss had been growing steadily uncomfortable since the strange group of teens performed the theme song, but seeing the unearthly beast battle was the last straw. He got up and declared that he wanted to go home. Henry Willow didn't take this news well. As the horrid abominations of biology fought down in the arena, Willow kept asking my boss to repeat himself. His face was almost childlike in his confusion. When the man finally understood that my boss wanted to leave, he had but one question. Why? Surely he could not be leaving in offense. This was exactly what the visions dictated. The scene playing out in the arena was a pure manifestation of my boss's life work. They had both had the same visions. They both knew that they were witnessing a cosmic good. Surely my boss didn't think Henry Willow was a madman. With every word the professor said, his voice turned colder. What was once an expression of genuine confusion slowly morphed into the petulant scowl of the child who has been told no. I tried stepping in, but with rough shove one of the Willow's giants put me back in my seat. My boss's voice shook as he spoke, but he delivered his message clearly. He did not think Henry Willow was a madman. What he saw did indeed please him. He found the professor to be a most generous host. The reason why he wanted to leave was because he just had a vision himself. He felt inspired. He needed to go back to his hotel room to collect his sketchpad and commit the dictate to paper. Surely someone who had the same exact visions would understand. The moment my boss invoked the visions, Willow's demeanor changed. He ordered the teens below to retract their hybrids. In flashes of static, the ungodly creatures disappeared and we were allowed to leave. When the escort took us down the hallways, the professor kept urging the giants to move quickly. Inspiration was not to be kept waiting. As we got out of the hill complex, Willow tried getting in the car with us, but my boss barred him. He had to work alone, he said. It would only take a couple of hours. Willow could come and visit at the hotel for lunch if he wanted, to see what the visions brought. Willow seemed deaf to the timing of his next visit, but he finally relented. We were sat in the car and driven back to the hotel by one of the giants. The drive was much shorter this time around. There was little life in our driver's eyes, but he kept his foot on the pedal. The guard we were assigned didn't seem to be fully capable of understanding complex sentences, but me and the boss stayed quiet for the whole ride. It wasn't until we got up to the hotel room that we felt safe talking. He wanted out immediately. I was more than happy to start booking tickets. It took a bit of googling, but I managed to find a train connection leaving in the morning that could take us to a city with an airport. By sunset, we would be a continent away from Henry Willow and his insane breed of science. I managed to book the tickets, even had them downloaded on the phone, but just as I was looking up instruction on how to get to the train station, the Wi-Fi in the room shut off. A couple of minutes later, someone started banging on the door. No words, just hits. Thunderous, dumb, no negotiable thumbs. There were 3 of them at the door, all identical, all wearing the same ill-fitting suits, all bigger than me. I barricaded the door with whatever furniture I could find, but I knew the giants would not be kept out for long if they make an effort. When I told my boss what was happening, he only had one question for me. Had I seen any other guests at the hotel since we arrived? Just as the reality of our situation started to dawn upon us, the phone rang. It was the professor. Unsurprisingly, Henry Willow had no interest in talking to me. He only had words for my superior. The professor pleaded with my boss to come back to see what other plans he had brewing, what other aspects of their shared vision had been brought to life. Even as Willow raved into the phone, his giants kept beating on our door. My boss tried excusing himself diplomatically, but Willow wasn't the one to be rebuffed. When the wood of the door started to crack, I grabbed the phone and spoke to Henry Willow myself. I told him in no uncertain terms that my boss didn't wish to speak to him. He was making him uncomfortable, and if he truly enjoys his work, the most respectful thing to do would be to leave him alone. The speeches worked on dozens of obsessive fans and stalkers, but I suspect much of it had to do with my physical presence. Through the phone, and with the 3 of his men bearing down our door, I didn't expect Willow to relent his mania. When I finished my speech, the other end of the line was quiet. Then, in a wounded voice, Henry Willow demanded I pass the phone back to my boss. With the giants now pushing up against the barricaded furniture, I followed the professor's instructions. All he asked was whether what I said was true. When my boss confirmed that Willow was indeed making him uncomfortable, Professor hung up. No long after, the banging against the furniture stopped. The giants had almost made their way past the barricade, but they left without a word. Neither of us slept that night. No giants came, the phone didn't ring, not even the cheery hotel staff came up to check on us. The rest of the night went by peacefully. The train to the nearest airport was at 8 o'clock. I was beyond vigilant as we made our way out of the hotel, fearing that Willow would send his men to capture us and take us back to his demented dome city. But he didn't. Our taxi driver to the train station had all of his hair and most of his teeth. The people at the train station were just as unremarkable. We boarded without incident. It wasn't until the train started moving that I breathed a sigh of relief. With every passing moment, we were further and further away from Henry Willow's insanity. I considered us safe. I considered the whole affair over. Not 15 minutes after we left the station, however, the train came to a screeching halt. A familiar trio approached our seats. The giants no longer wore their ill-fitting suits. They were dressed in riot gear, with rifles slung across their shoulders. Willow wore something that could only be described as a regal lab coat. Before I had a chance to even fully come to terms with the intrusion, I was yanked out of my seat. The giants did not speak, but their rifles were clear. I was not to move. Calmly, as if he weren't holding us at gunpoint, Henry Willow sat down next to my boss and started to speak. His voice was soft, pleading even. He spoke of a coming end of the world, how the final century was more certain by the day. It may be months, it may be years, it may be a decade or two, but the world we knew would come to an end. He told my boss that if he stayed, if he went back to the domed city, he would be spared the horrors that were to come. Yet it was not mere survival that Willow promised. My boss would live like a king, like a god among men. He would rule side by side with the professor and would finally get the respect he deserved. My boss didn't manage any words. Willow's stare, the giants, the guns, it was all too much for him. All my boss managed to do was shake his head. I feared that Willow would turn violent, that he would have us both shot on the spot, but he didn't. Instead, his shoulders slumped, the fire went out of his eyes, and he told my boss that he was sorry to hear his reply. With that, he left us be. Within 5 minutes, the train started to move once more. No one in the carriage ever acknowledged the sudden stop, or the armed men, or Henry Willow's presence. The rest of the train ride was eerily uneventful. In truth, I did not mind. I was just happy to get as far away from the madman as I could. It wasn't until we were going through the security checks at the airport that I remembered the 2 gold-plated watches I have grabbed at the hotel. They weren't showing a time, or at least not time in hours and minutes. Instead, on the digital screen, there was a counter. The numbers sat somewhere in high 20,000s, and they stayed that way until we landed. Then, a day later, the number dropped by 1. After a couple of days, I presumed that the numbers were days and were counting down to something. With the numbers high enough, I didn't worry much. Whatever was being counted down to was still far off. Yet it quickly became apparent that the numbers don't always go down by a full day. Sometimes it's a week, sometimes it's a month. A couple of days ago, the numbers dropped by a full 1,000. The display on both of the watches reads around 18,000 today, but I fear what it will show tomorrow. I fear how quickly those numbers will drop. I fear that Henry Willow's predictions of the final century will come to pass.
And so concludes this episode of the United People's Institute of Science series. Thank you for commenting and liking the video, and a special thank you to the patrons such as Kus, Bob Konderg, CR Iptid, Christopher Barunda, Dante Kincaid, Matthew Trahan, Mr. CreepyPasta, Daniel Wengel, Quiet Pills, Charlie Cooper, Joyce, Paul Evans, Shion, and Hayden Solomos. If you'd like to join these fine folks in supporting the arts and getting early access to content and your name in the credits, mosey on by patreon.com/MikeJLanger. That's it from me this week. Hope everyone is safe, sane, and healthy out there.